Well, this morning we have already seen some incredible windows into how beautiful it can be when God's people reflect His heart for the orphan, for the vulnerable child. And we will see many more before we're done. But those of you who have labored long in this work know that there's more to the story. You've also known loss and pain and deep disappointment. And as this community, as CAFO, we want to speak with authenticity about these things too. Just like the Psalms, we want to talk about both the beauty and the brokenness, and both the dawn and the darkness that precedes it. You know, as the images are beginning to flood in from the devastation in Nepal, I'm sure many of you cannot help but remember January 12th, 2010. On that day at 4:53 p.m., a devastating earthquake shook Haiti to the core, leaving death and destruction in its wake. And among the terrible tragedies that followed, there was a horrible outbreak of cholera later that year. But in what was just a tragic irony, this cholera was not caused by the earthquake or by looters or by corrupt governments. In fact, as the disease spread, people began to have this rumor that it had actually been brought into the country by the UN. And at first, the United Nations denied this ugly rumor, but investigation by two reporters ultimately discovered that it had almost certainly been brought into the country by UN peacekeepers coming from Nepal. And we can very much assume that these peacekeepers intended to bring nothing but good in their service in Haiti. And yet the disease that they imported cost some 8,000 lives and infected 6% of the Haitian population. Here is a fundamental truth. If we dare come close to the world at its most broken, we may see some success, but we will certainly see errors and unintended consequences and outcomes that are often far, far less than we had hoped they would be. Consider the famine in Somalia in 2011. There was this terrible famine, many of you remember, and the world rushed to bring food aid in, and countless lives were saved by that food aid. But we now know that a large portion of that food aid was also diverted, not only by corrupt governments, but also by regional warlords who actually used that food to secure their brutal control over certain regions and actually used it to purchase weapons that they used for death and destruction later. And I know many of you in this room have similar stories as well. It's the foster agency that approved foster parents only later to find that they had abused children. It's the adoption agency that had worked to place children in a family across the ocean and then realized that the children might have been better served staying in their home country. And it's the development organization that spent millions of dollars and then did a study and found that the results had been almost zero or perhaps worse. It's the Family Reunification Project last year that returned a girl to her family of birth only to find just weeks later that she was pregnant by her father. Wherever we serve, whatever our motives, we will find error and unintended consequences and outcomes that sometimes are far, far less than we had hoped. So what do we do with that? Knowing that any effort to love, to serve, to advance God's kingdom will sometimes be deeply disappointing. And in fact, it's not just the risk that things might go wrong, it's the guarantee that some things will go wrong. We will disappoint others. They will disappoint us. We will wonder if we should have gotten involved at all. So what do we do with that? Do we just throw in the towel? Do we not send in peacekeepers following disaster? Do we abandon adoption or foster care or family preservation? Just leave that to others? I have observed many friends walking this road. Some are old, some are still young. But as I listen to the stories of the ones that have persevered, who have kept at it, amidst long, long journeys of justice and mercy, I have noticed a similar arc in what their story has experienced. And at risk of perhaps being a little overly simplistic, I have really noticed 4 distinct phases in that journey. The first we could call waking. So the human soul has this powerful gravity self-worth. And we value relationships, right? But our thoughts continually pull towards self, towards my needs, towards my interests. And we can live as self-absorbed as any snoring sleeper. Just kind of like this. But for some, somewhere along the way, something shakes us and wakes us to the need that's always been right around us. Sometimes it is tragedy of our own that wakes us to the hurt of others. Sometimes it's a movie or a missions trip or an article we read. And we become suddenly aware of this need that's always been there, but we'd never seen before. And we begin to feel that something has changed that can't be turned back. We will never be the same. And if this waking grows to fullness, we desire to act. We begin to make choices, sometimes very hard ones, to give ourselves to the needs that we have now discovered. And as it continues, this waking can become a passion. And when we feel things strongly, we desire not only to act, but also for others to feel these things as well. And so here we can enter a second stage. We become advocates, or to use a more familiar term, cheerleaders. And as cheerleaders, we yearn for others to feel what we feel, to see what we see, to engage as we have been engaging. So let's try that right now, okay? We've got this here. Got some pom-poms. And I want you to dig back to your high school days if you went to high school. And let's try this out. All right? So when I say justice, you say now. Justice? Yeah. Justice. Yeah. When I say problem, you say solve it. Problem. Solve it. Problem. Solve it. When I say we should, you say care. We should. Fair. We should. Fair. Justice. Yeah. Problem. Solve it. We should. Fair. All right. Woo, see? Good job. So you know what I'm talking about. We become cheerleaders. And as cheerleaders, we often become very focused on a single problem. So it might be human trafficking or hunger or orphans or education. And we begin to feel that everyone should be involved with this particular problem, because if everyone did just a little more, man, we can solve this thing. And we know that some people have failed in the past, but that was because they did it the wrong way, unlike how we're going to do it now. And as cheerleaders, we often see problems as having just one dimension. And so the solutions we work towards often have just one dimension as well. So if the problem is poverty, then then money is the solution. And if the problem is disease, then medicine is the solution. If the problem is education, more schools are the solution. As cheerleaders, we're often tempted to let our enthusiasm drive our theology rather than vice versa. And so the verses we quote, how we interpret them, tend to all center around that one problem and that one solution that we have seized upon. And as cheerleaders, the stories we tell all tend to mirror the testimony genre, flowing from a very, very bad beginning to a very tidy, happy ending. And all this can go on for a very long time. But ultimately, reality ultimately seizes us, like a panther that's been stalking behind a hiker for a very long time. And this collision with reality could be called a third stage. It brings us into what we would call disillusionment. And sometimes it dawns on us slowly. Sometimes it's all at once in one catastrophic moment. But we begin to feel the sinking, sickening feeling that human need is far more complicated than we had imagined when we started. Now, everywhere we look, we see all manner of tangles and difficult things and disheartening outcomes. In disillusionment, we start to notice that every human need is somehow entangled with countless others. It's like pulling on a loose thread on a sweater. You know, we thought that just by a little tug, we'd get it all straightened out. But the more we pull, we realize not only is now that thread still there and longer, but other parts of the sweater have gotten all gnarled up as well. I remember a development worker from one of the world's most respected development agencies, after 2 years serving on the ground in Guatemala on a farming project, saying to me, "I'm not sure anyone here is any better off than the day I arrived." I remember an adoptive mom saying to me, "Our daughter loves her dad, but I think she hates me." In disillusionment, we are tempted to interpret these struggles we're facing as the suggestion that maybe we shouldn't have done this in the first place. In disillusionment, we can become not just frustrated, but even come to hate the people that we wanted to serve. The child whose deep hurts make them seem impervious to love, or the birth parents who keep turning back to drugs. Sometimes in disillusionment, we may actually cycle back and become cheerleaders again, only this time for different, superior solutions. And sometimes our new priority is kind of the opposite of what we championed before. So if we were passionate about church planting, now we scorn people who are focused on spiritual needs. If our passion was adoption, now we're only about family preservation. And in disillusionment, we often seek biblical reasons for our new priorities as well. So once again, our new ideas are driving our theology rather than vice versa. And in disillusionment, we are often tempted to use especially harsh words for those who are where we were just a few years or maybe a few months before. We judge both their methods and their motives. "Oh, there goes the great North American rescuer. Oh, isn't that cute? She wants an United Colors of Benetton family." And of course, this disillusionment does not only affect our mission. In the darkness, we begin to question the presence of God. Because at the beginning, we were so sure that He was with us, and now we have no idea. And when the presence of God is up for grabs, His goodness is as well. Does He even care at all? And this disillusionment is where many end. Some quit entirely. Some just become cynical, give themselves to criticizing others. Some continue in the work, but with just a shadow of their former energy and joy, now just stoic or fatalistic. So here is the big question. Is this the inevitable end to all big-hearted people? In some ways, I believe the answer is, unfortunately, yes. That all who desire to join God in works of justice and mercy will experience at least some disillusionment. It is Moses, that champion of justice, willing to take matters into his own hands, now chasing sheep around the desert. It's the great giant slayer, anointed king, now running for his life in the wilderness. It is that standout Pharisee, now blinded on the road to Damascus. There may even have been some of this in Jesus' 40 days in the wilderness. And in this place, we are tempted, just as Jesus was, to throw in the towel entirely. And yet, in this dry, desolate place, when the sufficiency of our own simple answers and even our very selves have proved totally inadequate, may lie the one doorway to the character and the heart and the vision that God ultimately desires us to carry into our work. James alludes to this in saying, "Let perseverance finish its work, so that you may be mature and complete, not lacking anything." Some, certainly not all, make it past disillusionment to a fourth stage. We might call it commitment amidst complexity. See, in this place, just as when we first woke to the need, we ache over the world's pain. And we feel joy, as at the beginning too, but now it is for very different reasons. It is not because we will solve the world's problems, and still less that we will be the solution. We feel joy because we know that we have been deeply loved, and that God calls us to reflect that love amidst a hurting world. So in commitment, we now know that the road is jagged and winding, and yet we commit anyway because we have been committed to. We risk because we have been risked for. And in this commitment, we refuse to take the seat of the critic who spends more time tearing down than building up. That doesn't mean we don't challenge others or correct them, but it's always with gentleness, because we know that we ourselves are almost certainly wrong in some of the things we are certain about. We also refuse to take that cold reserve of the purist who stands apart and says, until I know for certain that I will not make a mistake, I will not act. We do that knowing that to really live well, to love well, we must commit despite uncertainty. It actually makes me think of my grandparents who during the middle of World War II, when the world was on fire, decided that although everything was uncertain around them, my grandmother took a train with her mother and a wedding dress across the country to marry my grandfather in Boston. This next picture is them 50 years later, after many, many ups and downs and pains and sorrows and joys. Commitment amidst complexity. And even as we see and know that despite our very best efforts, that the goodness and healing we seek for our world will always be partial this side of heaven, yet in commitment we can yet still walk with calm and with gladness. This past summer, I was speaking at a camp, and after I talked about foster care and adoption, an elderly couple came up to me. The Webbs, they're from a small town in Northern California, and he's a retired Air Force pilot. And they wanted to share their story with me. And they told me how many years before, 3 decades before, they had fostered a number of kids. And they just desired to give these kids a love and embrace that maybe they had never experienced before. One of those kids was named Rick. And Rick always resisted their love and affection. And he would actually say to them, I know the rules. You touch me and I'll report you and they'll send you to jail. And one Thanksgiving, Mrs. Webb made this great Thanksgiving dinner, and right after the dinner, Rick went out, and he stole the neighbor's farm truck, and he drove it, and he actually crashed it. He was taken in by the authorities. They wouldn't let him go into a normal foster system after that. He ended up in a group home, well, first in juvenile hall, then in a group home. And as he got into adulthood, he was committing many different little crimes and ultimately ended up in prison. And he was there for several years, and literally within 2 days of getting out, he was rearrested again, breaking and entering into a home. And under California's 3 strikes laws, he was put into prison for life. And all these years later, I could still hear the pain in the Webb's voice. They wanted to tell this story. They had such high hopes for Rick. They had loved him the very best they could, and yet their love had proved inadequate to change the trajectory of his life. So what do we do when we're facing a reality like that? Is there anything to be done? Is there any way to move beyond disillusionment into real commitment amidst complexity without just becoming disenchanted and cynical? I believe there is a way. I really do. And I've seen this in many of those people I was telling you about that have made that journey. Part of the answer, part of it, and it is not insignificant, is this: we need good knowledge. Paul wrote, I pray that your love may abound more and more in knowledge and depth of insight so that you may be able to discern what is best. And here's a simple fact. The disillusionment only requires 2 ingredients: illusions plus time. So good knowledge is essential to preventing disillusionment. It's essential to engaging tough issues wisely and well. But here's another reality. No matter how good our knowledge, we will still face immense disappointments. And in those times, all the knowledge in the world is cold comfort. That is why I believe that there is one thing that uniquely can take us beyond waking and cheerleading and even disillusionment to commitment amidst complexity. And it is this: the gospel of Jesus Christ. And I want to pause here for just a moment, because I feel like if we say that lightly as some spiritual cliche, we are doing everyone a serious disservice, including ourselves. To try to encourage the disillusion with some spiritual cliche, it's like dumping snow in their pants and hoping it's going to warm them. It's true. This world does not need more spiritual cliches. If we are to give good counsel to others, if we are to stay in the work ourselves, we must be grounded on something that is at least as real and as true as the hurts we will encounter out there. And I believe the gospel passes that test. Let me tell you why. Because first of all, the gospel begins with realism. It tells us the depth of the human problem before we even get there. It says that the world's wound is not superficial. It runs deep. It has infected everything like gangrene, from the biggest government to the littlest strand of DNA. And the biggest problems of all lie within the human heart. So we don't imagine that we can run out and fix it all with just a little more money or a little more education or a little more development. Yes, we do pursue those things, because when done well, they can give a little glimpse into the healing and hope that God intends for humanity. But we do not imagine that any program can solve the deepest needs of the human heart. Gospel realism destroys illusions that breed disillusionment. Second, because the gospel demands humility. Because it tells us that the problem is not out there, that it's also in here. It's not just stupid, mean people that make the world a hard place to live. It's also us. So our methods and our motives and our great plans are suspect at best. Gospel humility teaches us that we must relentlessly seek critique and refining and growth, even, maybe especially in times when we are certain that we are right. Third, because the gospel gives us a new identity that does not hinge on our ability to solve problems. It teaches us that we are saved by mercy and not merit. So we don't depend for our identity on being great adoptive parents or wonderful foster parents or the director of some great ministry or some amazing advocates. We are simply sinners saved by grace. So we can continue to serve, whether in success or in apparent failure. Fourth, because the gospel calls us to community. It is not merely a transaction with God. It calls us to walk this journey with others. That is why Jesus never sent out the disciples alone. It's why Paul's letters are all from Paul and Timothy, Paul and Epaphroditus. That is how God intends it to be, that we are to serve together, to break bread together, to pray together, to carry each other's burdens. Gospel community can nourish us and even carry us when everything in us feels dead. Fifth, because the gospel teaches us that evil cannot be overcome without great personal cost. The gospel knows nothing of conquest from a distance, like sending in a cruise missile from far off. It comes near. It treats the victim of Ebola. It invites the child with a wounded past into our home, into our heart, knowing that they may hurt us also. Yes, governments and armies can push evil back, but they can never actually destroy it. The gospel tells it that evil is only destroyed when it is absorbed into the good, often with great pain, like a nail in the wrist or a spear in the side. And finally, 6, because gospel motivation is the only inspiration that is bigger than the world's hurt. Guilt and duty and idealism, they can carry us for a time, but only the gospel can prove larger than the world's vast, tenacious hurt. We love because he first loved us. And in all of this, we can hope for one more thing: gospel success. It is rarely as the world would describe it, and often not what we'd hoped for. Do you remember the boy Rick that I told you about? Well, he's still in prison. He's in his 40s now. But the Webbs have continued to stay in relationship with him. They send him letters. On his birthday and at Christmas, they send him gifts and books that tell about God's love. And just recently, he shared with them that amidst all the different foster families that he had stayed with over all his years in the system, not one of them stayed in touch with him, had any interest in communication with him, except for the Webbs. And in the last year, he's begun to read the books that they had sent him year after year. And he's also begun addressing his letters to them with a different beginning. Dear Mom and Dad. One can persevere in love like the Webbs if rooted deep in the gospel, in its realism, in its identity, in its community. And amidst all this, we labor and we keep our eyes looking for gospel success. Not the big things that we had hoped that it would be, but little shoots coming out of mustard seeds that tell us that despite the smallness, that God is working to bring greater good than we could have imagined. And if we continue in this, the road will stay difficult, for sure. But we will carry on past waking and past cheerleading and past disillusionment to a lasting commitment amidst complexity. We will find again the purpose, the heartache, the joy that we had when we first began, only now far more rooted deep and true. Let's pray. Oh Lord, root our hearts deep in your gospel. May that be the wellspring of all we do, Lord. And may you, by your deep, deep love, carry us past waking, past cheerleading, past disillusionment, to true commitment amidst complexity, Lord, drawing our life from you. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.